I just want to go inside what is turning into really the realization of what may have been a longtime objective of this White House, alternative facts. Here's Donald Trump on that ship that's pulling into port now about why he wanted them to stay on board. It was all about his numbers.
They would like to have the people come off. I'd rather have the people stay, but I'd go with them. I told them to make the final decision. I would rather, because I like the numbers being where they are. I don't need to have the numbers double because of one ship. That wasn't our fault.
Actually, Parker, I've never heard a president talk about that. That wasn't our fault. I mean, a president talks about taking care of all of our citizens. There's been a report that some passengers are very sick. There was an account that the most critical was the word used, would come off first. Is there any sort of accounting for the president's decision to leave sick people stuck on a boat?
Well, we've talked about this on your show before, about the president saying the quiet part out loud. And that's exactly what he did there. He sort of just publicly admitted what we've known, through reporting has been going on for a couple of weeks, which is that he's concerned about the numbers, the number of cases. He's concerned about the numbers in the stock exchange. He's concerned about the markets. He's concerned about the bad PR story. And that is driving a lot of his behavior. And I will say within the White House, there's a sense twofold. One is that since Vice President Pence took over, things have not been perfect, but they have been more organized and more streamlined. And there has been an effort to be more transparent and get more information out. But people in the White House privately will not defend that comment you just played by the president. They know it's not helpful. And it doesn't help them. The thing about this president also is that he drives the news. His tweets, his statements, they drive the news cycle. And the people trying to manage this crisis understand that in the case of a national, a global pandemic, what you want driving the news cycle is not the president's misinformation and his concern about the numbers. What you want are the experts speaking calmly, clearly, but also honestly to the American people and telling them, here's where you need to worry, here's where you don't need to worry. And, if you're in one of these hard-hit communities, this is what it means if your school gets closed down. And this is what long-distance learning is going to look like. And the president is preventing all of that from happening. So, yes, there is real, maybe not accountability, as you asked, but there is real internal frustration about how this is playing out from the top.
Who traveled with him on Friday and let him walk out before cameras at the CDC in a Make America Great Again hat? Who was on that trip, Ashley, staff-wise?
I'm trying to remember. I think Mark Meadows traveled with him. And that, of course, was when I'm pretty sure, you should double check me on that, but I'm pretty sure Meadows was on that trip. And that, of course, is when the president made that announcement that he would be the new chief of staff. One thing worth mentioning on that is people I talked to said they knew that change was going to come, but nobody exactly knew it was going to come then. But there was some frustration with acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney, in part because not only was he not on that trip, but he wasn't at the White House. He was sort of off on a personal day. And of course, people can take personal days. But again, for some of these people who have been working nonstop to try to deal with this issue, there was widespread frustration that he wasn't there, that he wasn't working. And they think that is one of the things that triggered the president's decision, which had already been made.
Ben Rhodes, if a foreign leader, like, the leader of China or Italy, were touring his or her nation's version of the CDC or the WHO in a cap that reflected their sports interest, that would be weird. If they were wearing a hat with the slogan of their re-election campaign on it, I think it would be noted internationally. What does this look like from foreign capitals to watch this president, as Ashley Parker just said, sort of pushing out information that reveals his insecurities about the numbers, the markets, the numbers of patients, and that really day after day after day after day contradicts the information coming out of our country's top scientists?
No, Nicolle, that's a great question. I mean, I think it asks us to step back and consider, well, what should a president be doing in this situation? Number one, you want a president who values expertise and wants to be surrounded by the people who can help him manage this kind of crisis. Instead, Donald Trump literally shut down the office at the White House that was created to deal with global pandemics 2 years ago. and continually disdains expertise. You want a president who speaks very clearly, provides fact-based information to people so they know how to be prepared in this country and around the world. We have a president who's been deliberately spreading misinformation about the coronavirus in order to try not to panic the markets, and he's ended up having the opposite effect. Importantly, Nicolle, a normal U.S. president would be spending a lot of their time right now, because this is a global pandemic, talking to foreign leaders. If President Obama was in office, he would be literally on video conferences with the leaders of all the major European countries to talk about what's happening in Italy. He'd be talking to the leader of China and other countries about how to manage mitigation factors across borders, so you don't have this kind of chaotic situation where different countries are doing different things, but there's a coordinated international response to what is happening. But none of that is happening, Nicolle. And we have so little expectations in Donald Trump, and the world has such little expectation in Donald Trump, that nobody is looking to him for leadership. As Joe Biden said, they're probably hoping that he stops making this problem worse and is quiet and lets the experts step forward. But we're literally finding out in real time what it is like to not have a responsible person in the office of the American presidency in the midst of a major crisis.
You know, Ben Rhodes, the other thing, and maybe this is a former staffer in me, and I wonder if you had the same reaction, I played the sound of Larry Kudlow, the president's top economic advisor, and Kellyanne Conway, someone who's been there since the beginning, who talked about alternative facts, to Ashley's point about saying the quiet part out loud. To use the very word, Kudlow, I will still argue to you this is contained. Conway, it is being contained. Do you not think it's being contained? The two health officials, Mr. Gottlieb and the country's Surgeon General, specifically said on television, in their capacity as experts, it cannot be contained. We are moving to mitigation, which has a very different meaning. It's either reckless disregard for the facts and the truth, which is plausible, or they're mistakes that no one is forcing them to clean up. Where is the quality control in terms of what the public is hearing?
Well, it's interesting, Nicolle. When the Ebola pandemic happened in 2014, we made a very conscious decision out of the White House, as one of the people who was responsible for communications, to not have ourselves be the lead communicators, to take a back seat. Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, went out every day with people like Tony Fauci and other experts who could provide this information on a daily basis at the White House press briefing. Bear in mind, that platform no longer exists. They don't have daily White House press briefings. When I see statements like that, you're left with the alarming choice between this is massive incompetence from people who don't know what's going on, or this is willful disinformation to try to cover up the fact that there is a growing risk of a pandemic in this country. And I think what we're seeing, Nicolle, is the outcome of people who've been able to live in a world of alternative facts, who've been able to count on a massive propaganda machine to spread whatever it is their version of the truth is on that given day. The problem is, when you're dealing with global markets and you're dealing with coronavirus, you can't control the narrative, because this is science. This is something that is happening in communities all across this country and all over the world. And ultimately, what we're seeing is what happens when that disinformation and that set of alternative facts collides with reality.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.